Today we're diving into two of the most terrifying real cave disasters ever witnessed. These aren't just stories about accidents. They're stories of brave men who knew the risks but pushed deeper anyway. Down where the walls are tight, the light disappears, and every breath becomes a battle. There's no one to call for help, because when you're hundreds of feet below, even a small mistake becomes final. As always, viewer discretion is advised. In 1997, an experienced cave diver, Rob Parker, dove into the forbidding depths of Four Sharks Blue Hole, unaware that a narrow, twisting passage would soon trap him in a deadly struggle for survival. Located in the Caribbean, the Bahamas boast more blue holes than anywhere else on Earth, with the highest concentration on Andros Island. Four Sharks Blue Hole isn't just a sinkhole, it's an offshore ocean blue hole, carved along a fault line inside the Bahamas Barrier Reef. Its entrance is deceptive, a shallow, coral-rimmed basin that hides one of the largest underwater caverns in the Bahamas. The first chamber, Calic Cavern, stretches 230 feet long and 65 feet wide, sloping down to a depth of 196 feet. But at the far end, at 131 feet, the real danger begins. A narrow crack, tight and twisting, dropping into blackness. No one knows how deep it goes. One wrong move against the jagged walls could be fatal. Yet, it was this danger that drew 35-year-old Rob Parker from Bournemouth, England, a fearless explorer hungry for challenge and mentored by cave diving legend Martin Farr. In 1984, Rob Parker began pushing the limits of cave diving, teaming up with legends like Bill Stone and exploring blue holes around the world. After Rob Palmer's death in August 1997, Rob Parker was picked to take his place, starring in a German TV documentary about the blue holes of the Bahamas. The filming would happen inside Four Sharks Blue Hole, one of the most dangerous, most mysterious caverns in the region. To prepare, Parker and his dive partner, 32-year-old Dan Malone, friends called him Duffer, had already been diving nearby. For 10 straight days, they dropped down to 350 feet, exploring a previously mapped cave system. Then they rested for 2 full days, flushing out the excess nitrogen that had built up in their bloodstreams. But before the film crew arrived, they saw a window. One last dive. Just Rob and Dan. No cameras, no director, and no rules. This time, they would push further. Rob had a plan. He wanted to enter the forbidden side passage, a tight, twisting crack he'd heard whispers about. It was too dangerous for the documentary, and he knew the crew would never allow it. So if they went now, no one would ever know. Dan hesitated. He knew the risks. But he also knew Rob, and he wasn't about to say no. He gave the nod. A few support divers offered to come along, but they'd stay in the main chamber, Calic Cavern, and wait. Only Rob and Dan would attempt the restriction. Only they would face whatever lay beyond. On August 19, 1997, Rob Parker and 32-year-old Dan Malone stood at the edge of Four Sharks Blue Hole as the sun dipped below the horizon. They had to time it perfectly. Unlike inland caves, ocean blue holes like Four Sharks experience powerful tidal surges. Water rushes in and out of the entrance like a throat inhaling and exhaling. The only safe window? A brief moment called slack tide, when the current pauses just long enough for divers to slip through. Their plan was simple. Drop to 220 feet using compressed air, then switch tanks and continue to 250. But during their first attempt earlier that day, they'd misjudged the tide. The water pulled hard. They turned back. But at 8 p.m., the tide finally stilled. Slack tide had arrived. This was their moment. They descended again, this time with purpose. Their tanks were side-mounted to help them squeeze through the twisting restriction ahead. The entrance to the forbidden passage was barely 2 feet wide, like crawling through a stone throat. But Rob and Dan slipped inside. They laid a guideline behind them, a lifeline through the darkness. They moved slowly, controlled, focused. After 20 minutes underwater, they reached it, the unexplored cavern, and it was beyond anything they'd imagined. Dan was stunned. All the buildup, the nerves, and the planning, and now they were here, floating in a hidden cathedral of rock and shadows. It was incredible and terrifying, because on the way in, they had almost gotten stuck. And now the clock was ticking. If the slack tide shifted even a few minutes early, the current could seal them inside, trapping them in the tight passage with no way to fight the flow. They had to go. As they turned back, Dan's heart skipped. One of his regulators failed. He quickly switched tanks, back to compressed air. It wasn't ideal, but they couldn't stop now. They were still deep inside the most dangerous part of the cave, and the way out was getting narrower by the second. This terrified him, but he kept a cool head. Then came the narcosis. It hit him hard, like slamming back a 12-pack of beer in 2 seconds. His vision swam, his limbs felt heavy. The world spun, but he didn't panic. He held steady. And after a few long moments, the rush began to fade. The cave steadied around him, and Dan slowly started to feel normal again. That's when he saw Rob signaling. Something was off. The signals weren't clear. Rob looked like he was in distress, but before Dan could react, Rob turned his head away and kept swimming, as if nothing had happened. Dan felt a knot form in his stomach. It didn't feel right, but out here in that dark, confined space, all he could do was follow Rob and get them both out. They continued up through the passage following the guideline. Dan was in front. Rob was just behind him. Then Dan noticed something strange. There were no bubbles behind him, no movement, no sound of fins. He turned. Rob had stopped kicking, and then he started sinking. Dan froze for a second. Rob was dropping like dead weight, free-falling in the water, no control, no resistance. Panic hit. Dan kicked hard and dove after him. It took nearly 30, maybe 40 feet before Dan reached him. He lunged forward, grabbed Rob's left ankle, and yanked him upward, stopping the fall just in time. Then he started swimming, dragging Rob with him through the cold, heavy silence. But in the chaos, both of Dan's swim fins slipped off. They were gone. And now every stroke was harder than the last. Dan looked at Rob. Bubbles were coming from his regulator. It looked like he was breathing, but he wasn't moving. Dan didn't stop. He swam forward, pulling Rob's body toward the narrow passage. Just as Dan was beginning to wonder how he would get Rob through the tight restriction, Rob stirred. He seemed to regain consciousness. The fact that Rob was conscious again felt like a miracle. Dan stared for a moment, almost in disbelief. Rob was awake, really awake, and kicking with the same rhythm as before, as if nothing had happened. Dan let go. For the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled inside his mask. Relief flooded through him. Rob was okay. He was swimming again. But then Dan looked down at his pressure gauge. His stomach tightened. There was barely any air left in his tank. It wasn't time to panic, but it was close. He and Rob had stashed spare tanks just beyond the passage. If they could make it there, they'd be safe. They entered the restriction. Dan dropped below the guideline, swimming through the center of the passage. Rob stayed just above it. The current was strong, pulsing through the narrow tunnel, pushing back against every movement. The deeper they went, the harder it became. Each foot forward felt like a fight. Dan clenched his jaw and pushed harder. The current surged. It was too strong now. He reached out and grabbed the guideline with both hands, gripping it like his life depended on it. Because it did. If he let go, he knew exactly what would happen. The current would suck him back into the cavern. The walls of the passage weren't smooth or uniform. They twisted, shifted, narrowed. He had to turn sideways, shifting his shoulders and angling his tanks just right to squeeze through. Rob was struggling too. Dan could hear the scrape of gear behind him, but Rob stayed close. Finally, Dan pushed through the tightest part of the passage. He was out. He lunged forward, grabbed one of the stage tanks they had left for decompression, and opened the valve. His hands shook as he brought the regulator to his mouth. The first breath was shallow, then another. Relief hit him like a wave. He was alive. If he had spent even a few more seconds fighting that restriction, if he had hesitated at all, he knew his air would have run out. He would have drowned, trapped in that tunnel. Dan turned his body around, aiming his light back into the restriction. Rob wasn't there. The space next to him was empty. He waited, eyes locked on the darkness, hoping to see the beam of Rob's light. Nothing. Just cold, still water. If Rob had his light on, Dan would have seen it. Panic returned. A cold, heavy dread filled his chest. Dan began waving his light anxiously, trying to get the attention of the support divers waiting in the main cavern. Finally, Dan managed to get the attention of support diver Tom, who was hovering in the main cavern. Dan waved his light and gave the hand signal. Rob had disappeared. Panic was already setting in, but the reality hit even harder. Dan, standing at 6 feet 4 inches and weighing 210 pounds, knew without a doubt there was no way he could return through that narrow crack to rescue Rob. The restriction was far too tight, and going back in was like ending his life. He looked at the decompression tank he had just switched to, but it was useless for a dive that deep. The gas mix inside was designed for shallow decompression. If he took it below 120 feet, it would turn toxic. There was no option. no second chance. Tom, the support diver, was low on air himself and didn't have the skills or the experience to squeeze through the restriction, find Rob, and drag him back. Even if they tried, just the two of them, it would have been a death sentence. They would have needed 3 tanks to get Rob through. That kind of maneuver inside that passage was impossible. Dan felt like he was trapped in a nightmare. Every breath, every movement felt like it wasn't real. He knew what had just happened. Rob was gone. Dan began his 3-hour decompression ascent. Floating in silence, alone with his thoughts, he replayed everything in his head. He wondered if Rob had even been conscious when he started kicking. Maybe it was just a reflex, an automatic motor function. Maybe Rob had never truly come back. When Dan surfaced, he felt dazed, his body exhausted, and his mind struggling to catch up with reality. After a while, he climbed back onto the dive boat. Rob's friend from the German TV crew was waiting. Dan told him what had happened. Rob was dead, and he wasn't coming back. Among the crew was Steffi, the widow of Rob Palmer, the man who was supposed to lead this expedition. She had joined the trip with confidence and trust. Now, her friend was gone. When she heard what happened, she was furious. No one had told her sooner. No one gave her the chance. Steffi said she could have been in that crack within 15 minutes. She believed she could have saved Rob's life. But Dan didn't agree. Not at all. He was glad no one had gone in after Rob, because if they had, they would have died too. It would have been a double drowning. The next day, Dan dove again, this time with Brian Kakuk, an American diver known for recovering the bodies of drowned divers, and with Steffi by his side. But Rob's body couldn't be recovered right away. It would take 2 more days before they could recover the body. The timing had to be perfect. The tides needed to align. Dan and Brian Kakuk, a veteran blue hole diver, descended once again into the system. They found Rob's body at a depth of 149 feet. But even then, the hardest part was still ahead. To get Rob through the narrow passage where Dan had last seen him, they had to remove all of his gear. Every strap, every tank, every obstacle had to be stripped away, piece by piece, just to move him. It was slow, painful, and emotionally exhausting. But finally, after what felt like forever, they brought Rob's body back to the surface. Even now, no one knows exactly why Rob died. There are different theories. Some suggest an equipment malfunction, others point to problems during the gas switch at depth. Whatever the cause, an issue with the breathing gas or its management likely triggered Rob's narcosis and loss of control. In recent years, Rob had been focusing more on filmmaking and his business partnership at a climbing wall back in Bristol. Diving had become a smaller part of his life, but Dan was clear about one thing. In his eyes, there was no one more meticulous than Rob. He didn't believe Rob was the kind of diver to make a careless mistake. Still, no autopsy was ever performed. The U.S. Coast Guard investigator, Mike Popovich, along with the other divers on the expedition, came to a likely conclusion. They believed Rob suffered from nitrogen narcosis, got disoriented, wedged himself into the restriction, and drowned. Rob was a highly accomplished diver. He specialized in deep blue holes. He had over 1,000 dives to his name, but in the last decade, his experience had been mostly in the past. In the 2 weeks before the accident, he had done a few dives, but before that, very little. And none as serious as the one they were on that day. On August 17th, Rob was cremated in England. Rob's death was a chilling reminder that even the most experienced divers are not immune to the dangers of underwater caves. Just a few months later, in another corner of Europe, a passionate Polish diver descended into the depths of Goul du Pont, determined to push his limits. But what began as a personal quest to break his own record would soon spiral into a fight for survival in one of France's most unforgiving cave systems. Goul du Pont is nestled in the picturesque region of Ardèche and Drôme in southwest France, lying beneath a railway viaduct near the small town of Bourg-Saint-Andéol. This area is known for its rugged landscapes and crystal-clear waters, drawing divers from around the world. The cave system of Goul du Pont is entirely flooded, entered through a narrow, walled-off pool measuring only 10 to 13 feet across. Its labyrinth of winding underwater passageways forms part of a larger hydrological network draining from the Remez Plateau. Divers must navigate twisting corridors and tight restrictions, making it accessible only to highly skilled technical divers. French explorers have pushed the depths here to an incredible 583 feet, revealing a breathtaking world of intricate rock formations and eerily clear waters. Wojtek Szymanowski was a 42-year-old Polish caving enthusiast who found his passion for cave diving in 2000 after watching younger divers explore the sumps of the Tatra Mountains. Despite promising his wife he wouldn't take up the risky sport, Wojtek enrolled in courses, purchased equipment, and threw himself into training with fierce determination. Known for his relentless self-motivation and love of overcoming adversity, he quickly rose to become one of Poland's top cave divers. By 2005, he had logged dozens of challenging dives across Europe and beyond, always pushing his limits and embracing technology with a passion matched only by his hunger for exploration. The Goul du Pont, which lies a short distance from the Goul de la Tannerie, was the second cave that Wojtek decided to explore. He considered it the perfect place to push his limits, to improve on his personal depth record of 337 feet, which he had set back in 2003. It was the morning of April 6, 2005. The town of Bourg-Saint-Andéol stirred gently under a soft spring sun. For most, it was just another peaceful day in southern France. But for Wojtek Szymanowski, it was a mission, a quiet battle between ambition and nature. He would be diving with his trusted Buddy Inspiration rebreather, a device that wasn't just advanced, it was revolutionary. Unlike traditional open-circuit scuba gear, the rebreather recycled the air he exhaled, constantly adjusting the oxygen and carbon dioxide levels. This allowed him to stay longer, go deeper, and carry less gas. But with that power came great risk. Rebreathers are unforgiving machines. A small glitch, and you're on your own. There had already been minor moisture issues with his setup that morning, leftover condensation from a shallow dive he'd done the night before in Goul de la Tannerie. But he checked everything, meticulously. Nothing seemed serious enough to cancel the dive. Wojtek was confident, experienced, and eager. On April 6, 2005, shortly after 9:30 a.m., he began his final pre-dive routine at the mouth of the Goul du Pont, an unassuming pool of still, clear water beneath the arches of an old French railway viaduct. He clipped on two 10-liter bailout cylinders, each weighing about 15 kilograms. One contained Trimix 1550, a helium-based gas mixture for deep diving. The other held nitrox 40%, a mix better suited for shallow use. Each tank had its purpose. Each was a lifeline in case his rebreather failed. At exactly 9:55 a.m., he submerged. He was heavily geared. The large yellow shell of his back-mounted rebreather looked like a turtle's carapace. Rigid, protective, but bulky. The side-mounted cylinders added more drag. In tight caves, this kind of gear can easily become a liability. But Wojtek wasn't worried. The Goul du Pont, he knew, was mostly spacious. Except for one area, a narrow, shingle-filled restriction at just 39 feet deep. As he moved past it and continued his descent, Wojtek had more on his mind than just the cave's beauty. There was something far more critical that demanded constant focus: his oxygen levels. The gas mix in his rebreather had to stay within a safe range, and it was his job to make sure it did. In theory, the automated control system on the rebreather should handle that with precision. But in practice, no computer is perfect. Electronics can misread, sensors can fail, and even a tiny error unnoticed could turn fatal at these depths. Wojtek had to stay alert, watching the readings, checking the numbers. He monitored every reading carefully. He knew that diving with a rebreather requires full attention. With every change in depth, he had to manually balance the internal gas pressure with the external water pressure. It sounds simple, but it was vital. Without those constant micro-adjustments, the rebreather wouldn't work, and if the rebreather failed, so would his ability to breathe. Soon, Wojtek entered a flat, horizontal tunnel, just beyond the constriction. It opened up wide, and the visibility was stunning. The water was crystal clear, even by cave diving standards. His helmet-mounted lights sliced through the blackness like car headlights on a highway at night. Just 246 feet from where he had started, the horizontal tunnel came to an abrupt end. The passage turned sharply and dropped. Suddenly, Wojtek was staring into the void as the tunnel began its steep descent at a depth of 59 feet. This is where the cave began to fight back. Getting deeper wasn't as easy as just pointing his head down and falling, not with the Buddy Inspiration rebreather on his back. Wojtek had to keep his body nearly horizontal. That was the only way to stay in control. Diving is a game of balance. To go deeper, the diver lets air out of the buoyancy control device strapped to their body. Add air, and they float. Take it away, and they sink. But the deeper they go, the more the water pressure squeezes the remaining air. the buoyancy fades. And if the diver doesn't keep adding fresh air, they fall faster and faster until they hit the bottom. To stop that, a diver has to keep adding fresh air to the BCD, just enough to slow the drop, not too much. Or the balance tips, and you start climbing. Wojtek knew the drill. He let out a little air and began to descend, slow and steady. For the next 197 feet, the cave dropped in a staircase of vertical steps, cut deep into the Fredic-shaped tunnel, guiding Wojtek further into the dark. But somewhere in that descent, things started to shift. As he dropped below 164 feet, nitrogen narcosis may have crept in, stronger than he expected. The world might have felt foggy, slower, off balance. Still, Wojtek didn't turn around. He'd never let a bad day block a big goal. He kept going. At 259 feet, the tunnel finally flattened into a wide, horizontal gallery. He pressed forward along the gallery, inching closer until he reached the top of a towering 98-foot pitch. But Wojtek didn't stop. Not now. By this point, narcosis had its grip on him. His thinking was clouded. Breathing, already difficult, was becoming a fight. But he was driven. A man who didn't back away from a challenge. And this was the dive that could break his record. He floated along the horizontal corridor, using his BCD to stay balanced in the water. Then, he vented a bit of air. His body began to sink, down into the pitch. Slowly at first, but the deeper he went, the worse it got. The narcosis grew stronger. His coordination faded. Simple tasks became hard. He had to keep adjusting the gas pressure in his rebreather, had to control how fast he was falling. The air itself was turning heavy, dense. Every breath now took effort. He wasn't gliding anymore, he was working just to stay alive. And then a chilling possibility. His rebreather might no longer be clearing all the carbon dioxide. Was he breathing some of it back in? According to research, one likely scenario stands out. Somewhere between 295 and 328 feet, where the water presses like stone and the mind slows under the weight of narcosis. Wojtek may have lost the ability to control both his buoyancy and the delicate gas pressures inside his rebreather. With every meter, the cave pressed in. The descent wasn't just deep, it was dangerous, and Wojtek was slipping further into it. Soon after, he fell out of control, until his body slammed into a narrow ledge at 344 feet. The impact, or maybe the desperate gasp for air, might have jolted him back for a moment, just long enough to try one final move. Wojtek had made custom changes to his rebreather. One of them gave him a last resort, a way to bypass the main system and breathe directly from a smaller backup cylinder built into the rig. It wasn't meant for long, just 60 to 90 seconds. But that was enough to switch over to an external emergency tank. He flipped the switch, and for a few precious seconds, he could breathe again. But something, whether mental, physical, or both, stopped him. The external tank was within reach, but he didn't, or couldn't, move. The action was simple, but it never came. The mouthpiece slipped from his lips, and Wojtek drowned, less than a minute after saving his own breath. By 3 p.m., when he failed to surface as planned, concern turned to dread. The surface team made 2 dives, reaching 230 feet, but there was no sign of him. The next morning, the French rescue team went back in. At the bottom of the 98-foot pitch, they found him, still mouthpiece out, resting at 344 feet. And with that, the grim task of recovery began. Because the death had occurred in France, an official investigation was opened. A presiding examiner requested a full expert analysis from a seasoned French diver. That report came in November 2005, and it revealed more than anyone expected. According to the final analysis, Wojtek drowned after the mouthpiece slipped from his mouth. But the deeper problem, the one that set the tragedy in motion, was the incorrect preparation of the diluent gas used in his dive. That single error became the primary cause of the accident. He was meant to begin the dive on a 1550 trimix and transition to a 1070 trimix as he descended deeper. That mix, with 70% helium and only 20% nitrogen, was designed to suppress the effects of narcosis. But somewhere between 262 and 296 feet, instead of injecting the correct gas, Wojtek mistakenly introduced plain air into his system. What followed was a sudden and overwhelming hit of nitrogen narcosis. The likely explanation was a simple but devastating oversight. Wojtek should have used the correct diluent by linking his 1550 trimix cylinder to the inflation point on his rebreather's counterlung. But at a depth between 262 and 296 feet, He shifted away from the external gas source and relied instead on the rebreather's internal diluent. He believed he was injecting a helium-rich 10 to 70 trimix. In reality, what entered his system was something far more dangerous. It was air. The narcosis hit instantly. For a diver at that depth, the sudden spike in nitrogen was like flipping a switch. His thoughts clouded, his reactions dulled, and his judgment blurred. Many in the diving community have long believed the fatal outcome was a result of using an unsuitable diluent, perhaps even paired with an unapproved CO2 absorbent. It's hard to grasp how a diver of Wadick's experience could enter a deep cave with an air diluent. But there's one theory. He may never have switched cylinders between dives. The day before, he'd dived Goul de Tonnerie. If he forgot, or assumed he had trimix in the cylinder, he could have descended with air in his system. And by the time he realized, it was too late. What remains certain is that the fragile balance of gases, equipment, and human limits in cave diving leaves no room for error. In the depths where light fades and silence reigns, every decision can mean the difference between life and death.